Hello and welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Have you had a good week? My name is John. Thank you very much for joining me for another exciting Great British Road journey. This week we're looking around more of Oxfordshire. In the last episode we took in the delights of Banbury and Oxford, so today we'll be scraping the barrel with a journey that'll take us from Thame to Wantage. I can't wait, so let's get crack-a-lackin'. We begin in Thame, a small market town that takes its name from the River Thame, not to be confused with the River Thames, although the River Thame is a tributary to the River Thames. The river passes by the town to the north, and where I am now is where it forms part of the border between Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. Today, the town features a bypass, specifically the A418. In the days of my guidebook, this didn't exist, and instead, one of the main roads in and out of the town was the B4011. But because of the bypass, this road has been rerouted, leaving behind some sections of abandoned road. And upon this abandoned road, we find a rather nice abandoned road bridge that today is used by pedestrians and idiot filmmakers. It's called Thame Bridge, and it used to carry the B4011 over the River Thame before it was replaced by the bypass. I'm not exactly sure how old it is, but it features on the oldest maps that I can find, so it's at least 200 years old. On those old maps, I noticed that part of the bridge takes the road over what's marked as the Crendon Pills. I don't know what these are. If you've got any ideas, let us know in the comments. It looks to me like a couple of ponds or indentations in the ground. I don't know. Nice bridge, though. My guidebook suggests maybe we'd like to take a visit to Gothic church. That's all it says. Not very helpful. But it turns out the guidebook is referring to St Mary's Church, which is found a handful of metres away from Thame Bridge. What a handy coincidence. Like all good churches, it's well old, or it was until it was extensively restored in the late 1800s, but there are some parts of the church left over from its original form dating back to the 1200s. What intrigues me about this structure is the peculiar octagonal or hexagonal bolt-on tower that's attached to the main bell tower. I assume it houses a staircase for access to the tower, but it's just a bit odd by being placed on the tower's exterior. In the centre of Thame is another interesting structure that was built in the 1880s, and it's the grade-listed Thame Town Hall that's been constructed in a Jacobean style, which takes a heavy influence from the English Renaissance period of the late 1500s. It was built to replace an ageing market hall that had stood in the same place since the 1600s, and whilst it was structurally sound, it was deemed no longer fit for purpose and was demolished to make way for the structure we see today. Interestingly, Thame Town Hall is made out of locally sourced organic red brick that was fired but a short distance away at a place called Christmas Hill Brickworks, which we would take a look at, but there's no trace of it left. A shame, because who doesn't like some old industry? But worry not, because a short distance along the B4445 is a small town that, in the days of my guidebook, was so small it doesn't even get a mention in my guidebook, yet despite that, it was once home to a large cement works, and whilst things have certainly changed over the years, there's one or two interesting things for us to take a look at. I've come to the town of Chinner, which, as mentioned, was such a small town it wasn't really worth talking about, but things changed in 1908 when a small limeworks was set up on the south side of the town. The structure you see behind me was one of 5 beehive lime kilns that was used to make the lime, which would go on to be used in agriculture or for construction, and it's the only surviving structure from the site's early days. In 1919, a cement plant was added to the site, and from this point on, the site only grew in size. By the 1960s, the works was covering 200 acres and featured 2 175-foot high chimneys that became a landmark for the area. One of the main raw materials required was chalk, and fortunately there was a massive supply readily available next door. At its peak, they were extracting 400,000 tonnes of chalk every year to make 225,000 tonnes of cement. An interesting test occurred at the chalk pits of Chinner in the 1970s, resulting in there being, somewhere around here, a 5-metre wide, 200-metre long tunnel. I've no idea if it still exists in any capacity, but what was the point of these tests? They were testing a huge tunnel boring machine, the sort of thing that we're quite familiar with today, but at the time it was brand new technology. The reason for the test is that they were planning to use the tunnel boring machine to construct the Channel Tunnel, on which construction began several years later in 1988. I do like old quarries, but we must move on, and we'll be heading out of Chinner via the B4009, which mostly follows its original route, but it all goes a bit tits up when we reach the M40 and the village of Luckner. And that's because the M40 motorway's construction led to the B4009 being completely realigned and a motorway junction being built right next to the village. The original route of the road would have looked something like this, and interestingly, if you're travelling on foot, you can follow the course of the original road right up until the M40 motorway, where a small diversion will take you underneath via an underpass where you can rejoin the original road on the other side. The next village along is Watlington, but before we get there I wanted to make a quick stop to take a look at Watlington railway station, or at least what's left of it. It's located a short distance outside of the village and was at the end of a branch line that would have taken you into Princes Risborough. The station opened in 1872 and would last until 1957, with the tracks being lifted in the early 1960s, but there are some leftovers of the original station. There's the remains of the main station building, some brickwork that related to a goods shed, and most interestingly a corrugated iron carriage shed. Our next stop brings us into the village of Watlington. In the days of my guidebook, a small place with only around 1,500 residents. That hasn't increased all that much over the years. Today there's around 2,800 people living here. My guidebook suggests that maybe we'd like to visit St Leonard's Church, which, sure, it's nice enough, but there's a bit of an odd story associated with this church, which, in order to understand, we need to take a quick trip out of the village and up Watlington Hill. Here is the hill, and on the hill we find a strange 82-metre-long shape in the ground that was supposedly installed in the year 1764. Today it's looked after by the local residents, and its existence is down to a bloke called Edward Horne, who was a local resident of Watlington. The story goes that Horne thought St Leonard's Church would look a whole heap better if it had a spire installed. The problem was nobody had the money or could be bothered to build one, so he came up with a genius way to make it look like the church had a spire. He dug a church spire shape out of the hillside that, when viewed from his home at the perfect angle, created an optical illusion, making the church appear to have a spire when it didn't. It's not exactly clear as to where he lived, so we can't replicate the view, but that doesn't really matter all that much because trees and buildings obscure the view. Today, the strange white shape is known as the White Mark of Watlington.
Well, that all sounds like absolute rubbish to me, but no bother, we're off to our next destination, and our journey takes us through Wallingford, a small town that, in the days of my guidebook, was actually located in Berkshire. It wouldn't become part of Oxfordshire until the mid-1970s.
And it's the same situation for the town of Didcot. 100 years ago it was in Berkshire, but that's no longer the case and it's now in Oxfordshire. Also back then, Didcot was far smaller than it is now. There were only around 1,000 people living here, a complete contrast to the 32,000 residents that live here today. The town's growth is mostly down to the railway. Even in the very early days, if we take a look at a map of Didcot, we can see that it's more railway than it is town, with a large railway junction taking up most of the space. Today, some of that space is taken up by the Didcot Railway Centre, a museum and preservation site that was built on the former Great Western Railway engine sheds and stabling yard. It's run by a charity known as the Great Western Society, and they've retained as many of the original GWR features as possible. The museum features two very special pieces of railway history implemented by Isambard Kingdom Brunel on the Great Western Railway. There's a short section of broad gauge track upon which they run the occasional broad gauge steam locomotive, but perhaps more interestingly than that, they've got a reconstruction of a piece of atmospheric railway complete with original Brunel pipework. An atmospheric railway uses differential air pressure to provide a method of propulsion or movement to a vehicle, and whilst it sounds very modern and fancy, it's an idea that dates back to the late 1700s. Brunel didn't invent it, but he did recognise its potential, and it was implemented on a short section of the South Devon Railway, but ultimately it proved to be quite an unreliable system, which led to its abandonment. There are very few examples of the original atmospheric railway pipework left, but you'll find some here at Didcot.
Onward to Wantage, our final destination. To get there we'll pick up the A417, but before we get too carried away, there's a quick detour I want to make via Newbury Road because there's an interesting structure to take a look at.
It's fair to say that this structure didn't exist in the days of my guidebook. Take a look at this. This is the Diamond Light Source building, or the synchrotron. I can't even pretend to understand what they do here. The words particles, matter and electrons are commonplace here, and the building's purpose is to produce intense beams of light to study science things.
Now basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it's produced by the modial interaction of magneto-reluctance and capacitive diractance.
So rather than a science lesson, I just thought we'd take a look at the £260 million building that was completed in 2007. I'm sure they've achieved many great things here, but I don't understand any of it. I don't know what to tell you. I can tell you that its location is very likely not a coincidence. The site that it's built on used to be an RAF airfield, but it closed in 1945 and was handed over to the Atomic Energy Research Establishment. These guys experimented with and developed some of the earliest nuclear reactors that would later go on to be used in power stations. With that in mind, it's clearly been a bit of a scientist's playground for decades, so who knows what they get up to these days. My guess is that if anything goes wrong at the synchrotron, Wantage will be vaporised, so I'm glad to visit whilst I still can. My guidebook suggests that it was a small town with only around 2,500 residents. It doesn't make any suggestions on things to do, but it does note that Wantage is the birthplace of Alfred the Great, born in the year 849. Hence the statue. But why was he so great? Well, he was made King of Wessex at age 23 and soon after introduced many favourable laws. He was a firm believer in education, so set about making educational materials available to all. Now, it was around this time that the Vikings were in the process of taking over the country, and for the most part, they'd succeeded. Until that is, they got to Wessex. Alfred said, nope, f off, not interested, and the Vikings failed to take over his county, or land, I don't know, but Alfred won, and since then, he's been considered great.
Really great.
What the shit is this? And there we are then, guys. That's all we've got time for this week. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there is, of course, a button specifically for that. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. That would be wicked sweet awesome. Enjoy the rest of your week, whatever it is you get up to. My name's John. You've been watching Auto Shenanigans, and I'll see you guys next time for another exciting Great British Road Journey. Until then, take care. Bye-bye. Like all good... I've forgotten the line. Hi, dog. Hello. Hello. Thanks.